Not every warbird earns its reputation in the heat of battle. Some, like the Grumman F8F Bearcat, built their legend in quieter skies, on carrier decks at war's end, in the smoke trails of air shows, and later on the racecourses of Reno. It was a fighter born too late to carve its name in the Pacific, yet too extraordinary to be forgotten. Compact, ferocious, and powered by the same double Wasp engine that roared in Hellcats and Corsairs, the Bearcat represented the very peak of piston engine design. For the Navy, it was insurance, an airplane ready to leap from any deck and outclimb anything in the sky. For the public, it soon became a symbol of speed and grace, a reminder that not all glory comes from combat. Speed and grace alone didn't explain the Bearcat. What set it apart was a piece of engineering that bordered on the unbelievable. Grumman's designers understood that raw horsepower could push an airframe into dangerous territory. A pilot caught in a hard dogfight might yank the stick too far, loading the wings with crushing G-forces. Instead of letting that stress rip the entire structure apart, the Bearcat carried a built-in safety valve. Out at the tips of its wings were deliberate weak points. Pull past 9 Gs, and those outer panels would shear away, shortening the span but leaving the core of the wing intact, strong enough to survive loads as high as 13 Gs. The idea was radical, almost shocking for its time: sacrifice a little surface to save the pilot and the airplane. In practice, it worked, but not without controversy. Test pilots marveled at the concept, yet many admitted they never wanted to feel it happen for real. The Navy eventually reinforced the wings and imposed a standard limit of 7.5 Gs, trading theoretical extremes for reliability. Still, the very presence of that breakaway system tells us everything about the Bearcat's philosophy. It wasn't built to be ordinary. It was built to live right on the edge, where risk and innovation met. For all its daring design, the Bearcat's brilliance wasn't just in the air. It was on the deck. In World War II, carriers weren't all the massive fleet flagships we picture today. Many were smaller escort carriers, cramped with limited space, their crews struggling to juggle aircraft in rough seas. Grumman knew that if a fighter was going to earn its keep, it had to be more than fast. It had to be practical. That's why the Bearcat was built small and light, almost like a hot rod trimmed to the essentials. Its shorter wingspan meant it could be spotted, refueled, and launched with remarkable efficiency. A squadron of Bearcats could cycle through sorties quicker than the heavier Hellcats or Corsairs, giving the fleet more strikes in a single day. Pilots praised the clear bubble canopy, which gave them precious visibility as they lined up over a pitching deck. And when it came to weapons, the Bearcat was no one-trick pony. With racks under the wings, it could carry rockets, bombs up to 1,000 pounds, or extra fuel tanks for longer patrols. In February 1945, when one prototype faced icy winds aboard the USS Charger, it proved the point. Even in sleet and crosswinds, the little fighter trapped cleanly and shot off the deck with confidence. On the carrier, time was life, and the Bearcat was built to save both. When the war ended, the Bearcat had barely reached the fleet. Peace meant fewer carriers at sea and far fewer chances to prove itself in combat. But the Navy wasn't about to let such a machine fade quietly. Instead, it gave the Bearcat a new stage: the open sky above cheering crowds. In 1946, a brand new demonstration team was formed, the Blue Angels. Their mission wasn't battle, it was public relations, reminding Americans why naval aviation mattered in a world suddenly at peace. For that role, the Bearcat was the perfect partner. Small, agile, and blindingly quick, it could carve tight loops and knife-edge passes close enough to thrill spectators without overwhelming the field. Painted in deep navy blue with gold lettering, the Bearcats of the Blue Angels became airborne ambassadors. At county fairs, seaside bases, and city airports, families watched as formations of 4 and 6 planes roared overhead, leaving graceful arcs of smoke. Veterans saw in them echoes of the war just past, while children saw the future of speed and flight. By 1949, the team had transitioned to jets, but the Bearcat had already stamped its image into American memory. It proved that glory wasn't limited to dogfights over the Pacific. It could also be won in the hearts of the people looking up from the ground. Behind the glamour of air shows, the Bearcat's real story was written in contracts and production lines. In October 1944, with the Pacific War still raging, the Navy placed an order for more than 2,000 F8Fs. Confidence was so high that General Motors' Eastern Aircraft Division was brought in to build nearly 1,900 more under the designation F3M1. It was a bold commitment, proof that admirals saw the Bearcat as the Navy's next frontline fighter. But history shifted faster than any assembly line. Japan surrendered in August 1945, only weeks after the first squadrons received their Bearcats. Almost overnight, the need for thousands of new piston fighters vanished. Contracts were slashed, and GM's entire F3M-1 program was canceled before a single example rolled out. By the time production ended in 1949, only about 1,265 Bearcats had been built, barely half of what had been planned. For Grumman's factory crews, known proudly as the Iron Works, it was a jarring reversal. One moment, they were racing to fill orders. The next, they were watching lines shut down and workers reassigned as jets took center stage. The Bearcat hadn't failed. It had simply arrived at the wrong moment. Designed for a war that ended too soon, it became a symbol of both promise and the abrupt changes of peace. If the Bearcat missed its war in the Pacific, it found another halfway around the world. In the early 1950s, France was fighting a bitter colonial war in Indochina, and its air force needed reliable, close support aircraft. Jet fighters were too fragile for the rough, short airstrips carved out of jungle valleys. What the French needed was a piston warhorse, rugged, compact, and able to haul bombs and rockets into a fight. Enter the surplus F8F. The United States supplied France with Bearcats, and by 1951 they were flying combat missions over Vietnam and Laos. Pilots praised their speed off the strip and their ability to dive hard on enemy positions. Against guerrilla forces with no real air arm, the Bearcat's job was to strafe, bomb, and rocket ground targets, and in that role, it served well. By 1956, as France pulled out, about 24 Bearcats were passed on to the fledgling South Vietnamese Air Force. For young pilots just learning to fly combat, the Bearcat was a stepping stone, fast enough to demand respect, forgiving enough to train a new generation. But by the early 1960s, heavier duty types like the Sky Raider and lighter trainers like the T-28 Trojan pushed it aside. Even so, for a brief chapter, the Bearcat fought its war, not over the Pacific, but in the steaming jungles of Southeast Asia. When its combat days ended, the Bearcat might have slipped quietly into museums. Instead, it found a second home in the hands of men who cared less about military orders and more about raw speed. Air racing, especially at Reno, became the proving ground. Here, the Bearcat would finally live up to the dream Grumman engineers imagined, an airplane stripped to its bones, powered to the edge, and flown flat out against the clock. One name led the charge: Darrell Greenemeyer. A former test pilot, he saw in the Bearcat the perfect platform to reclaim piston-powered glory. His highly modified Conquest I became a legend in its own right. In 1972, he used it to smash a record that had stood since Nazi Germany, setting a new time-to-climb mark, blasting to 9,800 feet in just 91.9 seconds. It was proof that even a quarter-century after its first flight, the Bearcat could still embarrass the best of Europe's designs. But the most famous racer of all was Rare Bear. Piloted by Lyle Shelton, this fire-breathing machine rewrote the record books. With its clipped wings, boosted engine, and countless refinements, Rare Bear tore around the pylons like no other. In 1989, it set the ultimate mark. 528.33 miles per hour over a 3-kilometer course, the fastest any piston airplane has ever flown. Year after year, fans at Reno watched it dominate, a purple and orange blur that seemed unstoppable. For Americans who grew up with the roar of Warbirds, Reno's races were living history. They weren't just watching a machine. They were watching what the Bearcat was always meant to be, the very edge of piston-powered flight. From the carrier decks of 1945 to the jungle airstrips of Indochina, from county fair crowds to the roaring pylons at Reno, the Grumman F8F Bearcat carved out a legacy unlike any other fighter. It was the pinnacle of piston design, small, muscular, and daring in every line. Though it missed its chance to duel over the Pacific, it proved itself in ways no one could have predicted. As a showpiece for the Navy, a warhorse in colonial conflicts, and a record breaker that carried piston power further than anyone dreamed possible. Today, only a handful still fly, but for those who hear that double wasp, thunder, the sound is unforgettable. The Bearcat reminds us that history isn't always written by victories in combat. Sometimes it's written by innovation, by spectacle, and by the sheer joy of flight. How about you? Do you remember seeing the Blue Angels in Bearcats after the war? Or maybe hearing the roar of Rare Bear at Reno? Share your memories in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Like this video if it brought one back. And don't forget to subscribe, because the legends of aviation are far from finished.